The next topic in the course is the topic that I actually personally do research on, and it's called action cognition. And we'll see that it's a broad umbrella for a number of processes that lead to physical action, but also processes related to interpreting other people's physical actions and our coordination with those physical actions and so forth. So what exactly is action cognition? Well, action cognition encompasses all the mental processes involved in the planning, preparation, and production of our own actions, and as I already said, as well as the mental processes involved in anticipating, predicting, and interpreting the actions of others. So this is a very active domain, quite literally. This is all about aligning our own actions with those of others, cooperating with each other, and so forth. Within action cognition, or just if you think of actions, there's one distinction between movement and action. A movement is considered to be a voluntary displacement of a body part in physical space. So that could just be a one-shot type of action. An action may be more complex though. Oftentimes an action is actually a series of movements that must be accomplished in order to reach some particular goal. So action is actually a goal-directed process where we translate our cognitive processes into some physical output that then brings about a change in the environment. When we look in the brain, there's a lot of areas involved in the production of actions, but three main areas are really kind of key. First of all, we have the primary motor cortex, M1, and this area is primary in the sense that it actually connects signals and converts signals to the spinal cord, which then sends it to the muscles and actually generates outputs in our body. So that's the first part. Neurons in that area control the fine motor movements and they send signals from the brain to the muscles. So that's sort of like a sending station. There's also two areas that are a little bit more abstract. So premotor area that you see right here is involved in setting up motor programs and sequencing them. So this is about a little bit higher level already, where you have multiple movements that can be part of an action. Each of those movements are then strung in the right order, and then as they come up, premotor area sends information to primary motor cortex, which then sends information down to the spinal cord in order to get the right muscles activated in the right order. Yet a higher level, more high level area is supplementary motor area, and this is really involved with setting up the plans for actions themselves. So if you think about making a cup of coffee, that's sort of an overarching plan that would get your supplementary motor cortex activated. And part of that would be activation that you need to put some water in the coffee maker. You need to then go to the fridge, get the actual coffee out, put a number of scoops in, push the on button and so forth. That's all at the level of supplementary motor area. Premotor area then sequences those things in the right order, and then the particular part of the sequence that we're on right now, that gets connected or communicated to primary motor cortex, and then primary motor cortex actually connects to the body and makes it happen. When we initiate a movement, we see that these areas indeed become activated, and this is based on some research that's been done with monkeys, where we see that different areas are active depending on whether movements or actions are internally triggered or externally triggered. And they differ in terms of their pre-movement and movement periods. So in other words, a more complex movement will typically have a longer pre-movement period where more planning is happening. And then movement periods themselves, right, the duration of actual movements may be modified as well. If you look at brain activation while these movements are happening, you see that there's complex interactions between the primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, and SMA. I already just spelled out why that is. It's because these actions typically have multiple steps in them, and they happen at sort of a higher level of abstraction, but then that higher level needs to ultimately be converted into muscle activation for the particular part of the action that you're now trying to implement. Of course, the prefrontal cortex, which is right next to supplementary motor area, that is no coincidence. Prefrontal cortex, we already saw, is involved in decision making, choosing to act, choosing not to act. So, of course, prefrontal cortex also connects to SMA, to supplementary motor area, and actually guides the decision to initiate an action in SMA. And then the cerebellum, all the way in the back of our brain, dangling here on the bottom, is another area that's actually involved in the temporal control of action sequences. So for example, and that's actually fine motor control. So if you play, for example, the violin or the piano, that fine coordination, or if you're typing on your phone, that fine kind of coordination and the temporal control of that, so that you hit the right keys in the right order, the cerebellum is highly involved in that as well. Now, throughout this, I'm already indicating that actions typically happen in some sort of sequence and movements happen in sequence. So there is almost never a movement that wasn't preceded by some other movement, and there's almost never a movement that's not followed by some other movement. The only time that happens, if you want, is right when you wake up, there's no preceding movement, and right when you go to sleep, there's no following movement. But throughout the day, we basically go through an enormously long sequence of actions. So William James, of course, was already interested in how this sequencing actually works. And if you look at the Principles of Psychology that William James wrote in 1890, that book is just fascinating because, of course, back in the day, he was really a pioneer in psychology. And if you look at that Principles of Psychology, he says pretty much something about almost any topic in psychology. Of course, some of the things now have turned out to be somewhat simplistic and incorrect, but nonetheless, William James had already ideas about this problem as well, the problem of how we sequence particular actions together. And it was a good starting point in that sense for trying to then figure out whether what James proposed was actually useful and powerful, or whether there was a better way of looking at that. What James proposed was that when we produce sequences of actions, it's just one long chain of reflexes where one particular action gives us some sensory input, and that sensory input then becomes the stimulus for the next response, and then that next response creates a new stimulus, new sensory input for the next response, and so forth. So basically, thinking about life this way, it is as if we're just going through one long sequence of reflex behaviors, and this is what William James thought was what was happening when people string together different actions. It's because of that called reflex chaining theory. So really only the first movement is initiated in an action, and then once that first movement goes, the rest follows from information coming back from the preceding response, sensory information comes back, and then there's a reflex to that information. That reflex then creates new sensory information and so forth. Now, hopefully you may feel some objection to this, because that really feels like we have very little control over our movements if most of it is just a reflex. And indeed, in the 1960s, a psychologist and medical doctor by the name of Carl Lashley came along and wrote a paper by the name of The Problem of Serial Order in Behavior. And throughout that paper, he made a very strong argument that sequences of movements are not based on chains of reflexes, but rather based on higher level plans that are much more intentional in nature. And in the next video, I'm going to give you a bunch of different pieces of evidence that Lashley proposed that actually drive home this point.